where did you find your passion for history? I know you grew up in Ohio, and how did you find a passion for Eastern Europe, and where did that stem from?
It's a long story, and to tell it, I'd have to compress a lot of things that happened very quickly when I was about your age. But I think one thing, when we grow up, we look for a connection between the trajectory of our own life and larger trajectories of other things that are going on, right? And so for me, that was the revolutions of 1989. That was the way that the world was changing. And if you ask about the connection to Ohio, there is no direct connection at all. I can say lots of things about being from Ohio, lots of things about Ohio. The kind of the sort of atmospheric thing, though, or the psychological thing, is that Ohio is the provinces, and for a long time, at least, in the way people saw things, Eastern Europe was also the provinces, and so I think there was a bit of a sort of like chip on the shoulder, let's even things out, let's go where other people haven't gone at the beginning. Maybe that in the West.
Was there one of the revolutions in '89 that interested you in particular?
I was like a lot of people in that I was attracted to the Czech dissidents. So I was reading Havel and some of those other guys before 1989 and in 1989, before I learned the languages. Like a lot of people, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of people in my generation found the Czechs the most accessible, right? Somehow the closest, maybe the most bourgeois, the most Western. But where I really got interested and where I really started was with Poland. Mm-hmm. And by the time I actually got into graduate study and was choosing a country, I had the view, which I think was correct, that it was the Polish Revolution which was the most important, or which really was the only one which you could call a revolution, and in some sense the other ones followed from it.
Right. So the election of Solidarity, and
the fact that something like Solidarity exists, right? I mean, sure, they have the first election, mm-hmm. and Solidarity wins it, surprisingly. But in order for that to happen, Solidarity already has to exist as something like civil society.
Exactly.
Right. And so that's what made Poland different. It was bigger. It was more of a bruiser. It could move the whole region, but it was that prior set of institutions and experiences which made it different. Sure.
What impact do you hope you've made with your findings in academia? What impact do you hope you've made overall?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, one of the nice things about being a historian is that you're maybe a little bit less vulnerable to the fashions of a discipline at a given time, and maybe a little bit more free to follow the sources and the moods of the past into things that were completely unfamiliar to you, and then that you can make familiar to other people. So one thing I think that any good historian wants to do is to make life seem richer just by adding things that weren't there before, which happen to be true.
Yeah. And
when I say things, I mean facts and situations, but also experiences and conjunctures and predicaments people found themselves in. In terms of this kind of goes back to your question about Ohio. I mean, I do have the aspiration to make my part of the world fit in with other parts of the world. Yeah. So it's not just a kind of compensatory thing that like, oh, here's a region you know about, but you really should know about my region. Or if you plug in Poland, and then laterally it's been Ukraine. If you plug in Ukraine, and then suddenly a lot of things that you thought you understood, now you understood much better. You understand much better.
Sure.
That sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just jump off that with a similar question, if you were to walk around a major American city these days and you see Ukrainian flags around, and you see a symbol like the trident featured on the Ukrainian flag, it's a very complicated symbol in a very complicated conflict. This urge that we might have as Americans to sort of make this conflict more black and white. Do you think that, or what is one thing that you wish Americans understood better about Russia and Ukraine at this time?
I'm hesitating a little on the premise because I'm not sure why
I certainly
I'm not sure why the trident is. No, I don't know why is the trident complicated.
Just the imagery of the early 20th century, and what that's come to mean now that you have the country being forced is not the word, uniting in the face of Russia, and
yeah. I mean, I'm going to take that in a slightly different direction.
Sure.
So one place the trident can take you is to Neptune. That was his symbol. And I make this point not incidentally because the way that Ukraine comes into a tradition with which people are familiar, which we tend to call Western civilization, is by way of contact with the Greeks.
Right.
So, ancient Greece, that 5th, 4th century Greece, that Greece of mythology and of art and philosophy and math, that Greece, that Athens, only existed thanks to an economic synthesis with the northern Black Sea coast. And one of the most interesting, actually the most interesting Greek drama, Iphigenia in Taurus, is actually set in what we now call Crimea.
Right.
And Achilles was supposedly buried on the island that we now call Snake Island, which the Russians took at the beginning and the Ukrainians took back. And all along throughout southern Ukraine, the steppe, there are graves of Scythians, including Scythian women, warriors, who the Greeks referred to as Amazons, and who we now know, in fact, existed. So one way to take the trident is to say there's a much longer history here than we're used to thinking about. The actual trident in actual Ukrainian history probably comes from the Khazars. It probably comes from the steppe. Right. It's probably a Khazar symbol, although nobody really knows for sure. When the Vikings turned Kiev into their capital, they took a lot of Khazar symbolism and Khazar terms. It's a very interesting moment, right? The Kiev as a political center is a kind of Viking, Khazar, Slavic, Byzantine synthesis.
Yeah.
So I say all that not because I'm trying to dodge your question, but because I think maybe the direction of the complexity is vertical rather than horizontal. That is to say, it goes like the interest in what's interesting about Ukraine is actually that it has such a rich and long history. Which I'm not trying to say, by the way, the Ukrainians have walked the earth, since the time of the giant sloth. What I'm trying to say is that the land and the peoples on it have an incredibly interesting history. Going back to a little bit your earlier question, and if you look at the history of Ukraine at any given point, this is also true of Jewish history. If you look at it at any given point, then things you think you thought you understood, then suddenly become actually more interesting or bigger. So as far as like Americans, I mean, my only I taught a class, a public class at Yale on Ukrainian history, where I basically took a shot at this, although all I was really doing was teaching my Yale class. And then we had this funny situation where for every Yale student, there were like 50 or 60,000, non-Yale students, as it were, looking over their shoulders.
I was one of those students last year.
That's nice. So, with Americans, I think the main thing I would wish for us is just, rather than saying any particular thing about Ukraine, although it would impress me, it's more that we need to realize that other people are agents in history too. Because we are really insistent that our own ignorance or our own concepts or our own prejudices must be the things that matter.
Right.
And we're like, and we can even learn something about a country and then we forget it and we default back. So like, for example, people are still just to give one example, it's 2 years in and people are still talking about, admittedly stupid people, but people are still talking about Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. And that's like, we want it to be about ethnicity, because for us ethnicity is about barbarity, and so we want to be able to, distant people's ethnicity is the right way to think about it. Not for us, of course, but for distant peoples. And it's not just that it's wrong, And it is wrong. I mean, the president of Ukraine is a Russian speaker, and most of the Ukrainian are in the language of the Ukrainian army, and so on. It makes no sense, and the logic of it makes no sense. I mean, if what you spoke determined who you belong to, then we'd all be in England right now, et cetera, et cetera. But it's the wrong set of concepts. Like it's a misunderstanding of what a nation is. A nation has to do with what you're willing to take risks for, like what future you're willing to take risks for. So I'll leave it. Maybe that's the thing, though. I mean that it connects to worry about Americans, because if you like the thing that Americans sometimes have trouble understanding, or I think the thing that really bothers a lot of Americans about Ukrainians, the ones who don't support Ukraine, right, is that Ukrainians are actually out there taking risks. And I think that makes a lot of Americans feel uncomfortable because they no longer believe, or they just that there's anything worth taking risks for, including their own country. Right. And so I think
we should wrap it up then.
Okay. I was making a really great point.
Okay, please.
No, that was it. I was done. That was a period. That was a full stop.
Beautiful. You guys got all that?
Yes.
Thank you
awesome.
so much.
Thank you.
You can edit out the part where I said I was making a really great point.
Yeah.
You can cut that out.
I know you won't. You're the lead with that. Like Snyder says he was making.